there. Welcome back to the Prolific Author Podcast. We are here with author Nicole York. How are you, Nicole?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing good. Glad to have you here. We were just kind of discussing your name, that your last name is York, and everybody thinks you're in New York, but you're actually not. You're in New Mexico.
Yes, yeah. I am down here in Albuquerque cooking in 100-degree weather. So
Yeah.
although I'm sure I might be willing to trade the dryness here for the humidity in New York, I think I'll take the dryness.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I'm just north of you, and I don't do the humidity very well either. That's what happens when you live in a dry state. You don't know how to handle it.
This is true.
Great. Well, why don't you tell everybody who you are and what you write?
Awesome. So my name is Nicole York, and I write fantasy under the pen name Nicole McEwen, which is actually my dad's last name. And I did that originally because I thought as a photographer that it would be confusing to people if they went to look me up as an author and found photos or vice versa. I didn't realize that trying to maintain two entirely separate identities would be such a headache as far as trying to keep track of all the different social media and everything. But I decided to kind of combine those things because my whole artistic career, authoring included, is built around telling stories. So in my visual art, I tell stories, and in my narrative art, I tell stories. But my whole goal is essentially just to build bridges back to fairyland, back to a place where, wonder still exists and anything is possible, and we can believe the best or the most amazing things about ourselves without restrictions. So whether that's through novels like the Founding Trilogy, which is, the first, my first kind of foray into the world of authoring, or through photographs. That's my whole goal, is just to help people get back there.
Yeah, I love that. I really love that. So did you keep the two separate names, or did you end up combining them?
So I have combined them for my, so on my website and a lot of the social media, it just says Nicole Creates because that's what I do. And it made sense. But for the first books, because I began as Nicole McEwen, that is still currently the pen name that I'm using. So when people look me up, that's how they have to find me.
Okay, gotcha. So you've got the separate for like books and then photography, but on social media, it's all the same. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's Nicole Creates or Nicole York everywhere. So the pen name is essentially just for like the books themselves.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, and maybe we should talk about that more, because it's difficult to have different pen names and different identities. But why don't you talk about, how did you get into writing specifically and into fantasy?
Sure. So like I'm sure every author always says, I've been writing since I was a kid. But it's true. I started trying to make stories, and I wanted to live in a world where, as small as insignificant as I felt, I could still secretly be somebody special. And growing up, we moved a lot, and there was a lot of kind of tumultuous activity in my home as a kid. And so fantasy and movies like Legend or The Labyrinth or, Willow, anything where it was like, oh, even small and insignificant people can go and slay the dragons or be somebody great. I really was drawn to that. And even running off into the woods as a kid, if I could be outside, I was outside. And I always felt like this would be the place where the fairies would find me at last. And so I wanted to write myself into that. My whole goal was always to, take myself out of the real world and into a place where the magic could happen. And so I started that at a young age, fell deep and hard into romance novels when I was in a teen, with like old ones too, like Joanna Lindsay and all of that stuff.
Right.
Started reading those hardcore and was like, I want a romance like this. So I tried to write those for myself. And then once I was a mom, of course, a lot of that had to fall away. I didn't have time. But my kids got a little bit older, and I wrote my first book, which I realized as I neared the end, I didn't have the chops yet to actually pull it off the way that I wanted to do the story justice. So I had to shelf that one. It's not shelved forever, just until I'm good enough to write it. And then I started writing this trilogy. I started with the first book because Allie, who is the main character, she's just one of those people who came into my head fully formed. And I heard a line of dialogue from her in my head. I was like, who is this? This is a really interesting person. What can I write about her? And so that kind of built that. And I think that was in 2013 or 2015. Oh, around 2015, I guess. No, 2013. Yeah, I'm right. Time is irrelevant to me. I don't know when it is. I don't even know what year it is.
The last 2 years, they just kind of threw everybody through a loop. They don't even really count.
Yeah, I agree.
Oh, that's great. So, how you talked about hearing a line of dialogue from this character. So, how do you go about, creating character voice, I guess? I mean, you said she came fully formed into your head, but when you move forward in other stories, does that always happen, or do you have a way of crafting character voice?
That's a great question. So it always happens to some extent. So there's always at least a character or a few characters who just show up in my head being who they are. And then every now and then I'll get a character that I just, for some reason, I don't know them well enough to be able to hear their voice. And then I have to go figure them out. So for the villain in the first couple of books, I actually had to go write a short story about him because I couldn't get him. He just wasn't there. It's like, who is this person and where do they come from? And why did they make the decisions they did that brought them to this place? So I went and I wrote a short story about them just to figure out who they were. And that really helped codify and solidify their voice in my head. And I think sometimes that happens just based on your kind of visual library. And I say visual because I'm a highly, as a photographer and an artist, I'm a highly visual
Right.
person. So I see them and I hear them, but we're constantly consuming what's around us and putting these bits and pieces into the library that we use to draw from when we make things. And so every now and then all those pieces come together the right way. And then every now and then they just kind of hit each other and fall apart and I don't know where they go and I have to piece them back together through a story.
Right, right. So if you had one of these characters that you felt like you didn't know very well, how would you go through that process for them?
So I first start by asking myself where they're from. What was the culture like? What was the uh, landscape like? Kind of economy is there? Just because an agrarian society is going to breed a different kind of speaker and a different kind of
Mhm.
person than an industrial society.
Right.
Where are they at in their timeline? Have they hit something like an industrial revolution yet? Or have they had great breakthroughs in science? Or is this still very much, a hunter-gatherer place? Knowing where they come from is a first really big step for me because that is going to influence things like the euphemisms they use and the idioms they use and how they speak to one another. And then I start asking my things like, well, what is the culture like from a moral standpoint? Or
Mm.
do they have certain taboos that this character is really going to have brought with them into their speech? And then also, once I have those things and I have a good picture of where the character is from, then I start asking myself, how did that affect them as a person? Are they the kind of person who, felt really comforted and sheltered by their society and their location? Or are they kind of a person who felt like an outcast and they didn't fit? So they're actively trying not to be the kind of person who comes from a place like that. And of course, that's a
Right.
spectrum because there's anywhere in between. But when
Yeah.
that happens, it really starts to form that person in my head. And then I know, okay, well, here's somebody who feels like their culture, their community let them down. And so they feel like a bit of an outcast. And so they've distanced themselves. And maybe those things show up in their speech a little bit unconsciously, but they're actively trying to separate themselves. And so that helps, drive how I hear them in my head. And so that's really the start. Where do they come from? What was that place like? How did it affect them as a person? And that's kind of the, I guess, foundation of how I begin hearing their voice.
Yeah, yeah. No, I like that. I think questions are the best way to kick out any element of your story, and that's part of what I teach. So I love that you have specific questions like that. And do you play at all with you said, sometimes I know not all the characters this will be true of, but you have one where they're trying to repress it, but it's coming through a little bit. Do you purposely put that in at different points of the story where it comes through unconsciously for them?
Yeah, for sure. And usually it has to do with a time when they are so engaged that they can't modulate themselves anymore. So often when people are angry, those things will start to
Right.
show up. So maybe when somebody's angry, all of a sudden they use some euphemism that doesn't make sense for the way that they normally speak, or their accent shows up, or those kinds of things happen. If they're really excited or they can't kind of control or filter themselves anymore, that's usually if I have a character who's actively doing that, that's when those things tend to appear.
Yeah, I love that. That's super fun to to play with and figure out what those moments are. So do you go through and come up with specific, like you said euphemisms and you talked about accents, like words and phrases that they use that are specific to them?
Oh yeah, always. So, often, with the founding trilogy, the main character, Allie, she's a very contemporary person. And so it's really, and she's from the West Coast, which I'm from the West Coast. So it's really easy
Right.
to make her speak in a way that's believable. But for the characters who aren't, that's where knowing where they're from really makes a difference. So like, are they from a place where a lot of fishing analogies are going to be, used? Or
Right.
if they had to have an exclamation, or if they needed to swear, is that going to sound very much like the kind of swearing I would do, or is that going to say something like mother of the goddess? Like
Right.
how are they going to form those kinds of things? So no, that's another time where knowing where they come from really helps me give them those. And then just knowing the character. So one character, Sonia, she's one of those characters who has very much distanced herself from the place that she used to be, but there's still elements where she's tried to reclaim her identity in a way. And so when she has certain words and phrases that she'll say often, or a way of speaking that's very kind of lazy and rolling, and she'll say darling and things like that. And so, the way that she speaks is informed by where she comes from and who she is, but also when you hear her use these words, the more you get to know her and understand the way that she speaks, the more you can tell when she's using them as almost camouflage, to sound like she doesn't care, or convince herself that she doesn't care, when
Right.
that becomes a red flag and you're like, oh, she said that thing, she must be upset about something.
Right. Right. Yeah,
And
that's
I think that
awesome.
helps. Yeah.
Yeah. So have you what has been the response you've gotten? Have you had a lot of people tell you that they're picking up on these things and that they love your stories because of it?
Yeah, one of the main pieces of feedback that I get from my readers is that they really connected to the characters. In fact, if it takes them a little while to connect with Allie, because she is kind of a brash, sarcastic type of person, they will tell me how much they love. They're like, it was the side characters that kept me in things long enough to fall in love with the main character, or they were so well drawn, is usually, kind of the feedback that I get from that. And I think that's because they are super distinct in my head, and I can't
Right.
hear them in anything other than their own voice. Once I know them and their way of speak, they exist. I can see them, I can hear them speak, and so it's difficult to mistake one for the other, I think, at that
Right.
point. And readers definitely seem to pick up on that.
Good. Yeah. And I think especially for new authors, that's one problem that a lot of newbie authors have is the very first thing they write, all the characters sound the same. So this is almost like a step by step for how to make sure that your characters do not sound the same and that the reader can tell who it is, even if you don't name them right away.
For sure. And I think oftentimes when you're just beginning, many writers will write in their own voice. So they'll write the dialogue as if they would say it, as if I was the one who
Right.
was going to say it. Um, and it really takes a little bit of an exercise in visualization and like character study to separate those people into their own things. And I think movies are really great for this, for anybody who, would take the time to study movies and just notice those differences in how writers have been able to characterize the way that people say things, and then how the actor does that again. Like Anthony Hopkins is
Right.
fantastic, right? Nobody speaks like him. He has lots of pauses for emphasis, and he has a lot of subtext in the way he says words. And if you can study things like that and then kind of transmute that into your head for your characters, even if you maybe start by replacing your characters with actors that you love, even
Hmm.
that could probably help to go, well, how would they say this thing, not how would I say this thing.
Right. Right. And so do you spend a lot of time doing these visualization, or you'd almost call them auditory, like hearing the voice in your head?
I'm a complete movie nerd, and so I love movies, and they deeply influence the way that I think and hear and see people. But also as a visual artist, I think I'm one of those, either you could say it's either a blessing or a curse, but I can see things very, very clearly in my head. And
Yeah.
so that means that all of my worries get expanded to like gargantuan proportions, right? But also all of the things I see are just really vivid. And so it's difficult to see somebody for who they are, the way that they dress, the way that they hold themselves, and then not hear them. So I think,
Right.
fun little piece of science, your brain has a really difficult time telling the difference between a vividly imagined fantasy and reality. And so this is obviously like, this is a technique that professional athletes use a lot in order to practice when they can't actually practice. And they've even been able to find differences in muscle mass between people who do really good deep visualization and people who don't, athletes who don't. And so you can improve your muscle memory and all of that kind of stuff. And then the same thing is true when you imagine these characters. The more clearly you see them, the more clearly they interact with one another in your head and all of those things. Then, of course, that translates audio in a way. You hear them more clearly and they just become a lot more real. So at that point, it's hard not for them. It's hard for them not to be individual, I guess.
Yeah.
Did that answer the question?
Yes, no, it did. It did. There's so much to unpack there, but I think that's fabulous. I mean, I have my thoughts going in a bunch of different directions. I mean, on the one hand, we're giving everyone permission to sit and visualize their characters and maybe sit and watch Netflix. But the other thing is, I think it also comes back to detail. We know when it comes to description and showing, not telling, and all of those things we're told to do, it's all about the details. And so I was just thinking that it's so much easier to hear a character voice, like you were saying, if you just say, oh, this is an elderly doctor type versus this is an elderly doctor type that speaks like Anthony Hopkins and pauses here and there and has all these mannerisms and dresses this way. I mean, it's just a whole different ball game when you picture the details like that.
For sure. And I think you hit on something that's so important too, because a lot of people will make the mistake of thinking that character voice is just what the character says. And it's not. Character voice is how a character represents themselves and interacts with the world. And so we are the ones who interpret character voice, right? Like as the reader, we are the ones who interpret that. And so in order to make that dialogue representative of the character, you have to know who they are. And so like going with your doctor example, is this a doctor who is arrogant, overconfident, highly educated? Or is this a doctor who came, worked their way into med school living off of crackers and comes from, the wrong side of the tracks and has a lot of empathy to people or for people? And then of course that's going to influence, is this somebody whose mind is always running 1,000,000 miles a minute and they speak in quick choppy sentences and they get distracted by their own conclusions? Or is this somebody who's highly methodical and the way that they speak reflects, very carefully chosen words and all of that kind of stuff? So yeah, like once you have that picture, and if the picture in your head walks in with their lab coat all rumpled and, their stethoscope hanging off of one shoulder and looking like they haven't slept in days, how does that person sound? As opposed to somebody who walks in very neat and organized and, what's the difference there? And like seeing those things just really, really helps form how they would then express themselves, I think.
Yeah. As authors, we almost need like a degree in psychology to, figure all this stuff out. So a couple of technical questions for you that I thought of earlier when you were, talking about the technique. When you, for example, do something where, like you were saying, they're trying to repress something and then it comes out in a moment of passion or high emotion. Do you draw attention to that in the narrative of your book? Like, do you have another character actually observe that for the audience, or do you just allow the audience to pick up on it on their own?
It's interesting because I know before we got to do this interview, we talked a little bit about trusting the audience and and how do we make those decisions? So sometimes I will hang a lantern on it. I think if the character who's listening to them speak is noticing it. So I guess in some ways, to answer that question, in some ways it depends on point of view. So if I'm writing first person and the first person character is getting to know these people, then that character may notice and say, oh, she's never said that before. She's really mad. Like, maybe they would notice that. Or if it is the character themselves that is speaking, I may just let the reader clue into that as the story progresses. And I'm definitely one of those writers who I like to kind of dribble in exposition as the story goes for backstory. And so I may not say anything right away and then mention later on, oh, this happened to me at some time and, in my past, and then allow those breadcrumbs to kind of form a bread ball where the reader goes, I got it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I was kind of thinking that it would probably depend on the character. What was I going to say? I almost think you could, if you had enough foresight on your story and were planning, it would be interesting to almost show it independent of the character, like show someone else from the wrong side of the track speaking that way. And then, but there is something to be said for letting the reader figure it out. One thing that I think, I kind of harp on it a little bit, but that I think Hollywood doesn't always do very well, is they don't trust their audience as much as they should. And I think with readers, I mean, our readers, of course, we need to make it very easy for them to understand. We're always talking about making the story very accessible and the writing really good and everything. But we also need to trust them, because our readers are looking for patterns and they're looking for things to connect. So how do you have any kind of rules, or the way that you handle that, trying to get yourself to trust the reader more or less, or, talk to us about that.
Yeah, I think that's always a difficult thing, because as the writer, we know everything about the story. And so it can be difficult to balance what things we know and remove ourselves from that situation, be like, okay, well, the audience doesn't know this. So how do I do that? And I think a writer who does this really brilliantly, let me say that one more time, really brilliantly, is Neil Gaiman. He absolutely assumes that the audience is going to figure it out. He leaves a lot to the imagination, and he never holds your hand. So there are absolutely times when reading his books and I'm like, wait a minute, why is this isn't and then 10 pages or 2 chapters or whatever, I'll have enough context where I can put things together. And I think that that's one of the things people really enjoy about his work, is that he's not talking down to them. However, that does, like you said, absolutely mean that some readers are not going to find his work accessible. So I think that's a question we have to ask ourselves, as far as, do I want to make this as readable by everybody as possible? Or do I understand that my audience consists of a really kind of niche group of people, and I have to make the assumption that they're going to clue into these context clues, like, if we include a lot of current, pop culture type of references, are they going to pick these things up, and does that matter? Or do I need to make sure that I, don't include that? But then also, maybe hopefully to like bring this whole rambling thought together, is always, I think, make it easier first, and then go back and ask how important it is for somebody to follow this clearly. So like, if I know my audience, and I know that I'm shooting for a wide group of people to make it super easily accessible, I write it all blatantly, and then I go, okay, is this something that they need to know? Or have I built the context clues into this well enough that they're still going to get it? And I think that's when beta readers really come in, or even alpha readers really come in and show how important they are, because they're going to let you know if you did it or not. But if you err on the side of trusting the reader, you will absolutely get folks who are upset and feel like you were hiding things from them, or like you weren't making it easy. And if you don't trust the reader, you are absolutely going to get people who said they were holding my hand. So I think you have to err on the side of what feels the most natural to do, and just recognize it's not going to be for everybody, because you can't. That's the great part about having so many authors, is we get to pick and choose the ones who write for us. Right.
Yeah, I love everything you just said. You explained it really thoroughly. And so like, what it comes down to is, the answer, as with all things in writing, is, well, it depends. There's just not an umbrella, answer that's going to apply to everyone. And you actually answered my next question. I was going to ask you if you had a critique group or beta readers or anything. So do you put all of your work through people like that then?
When I can, yeah. Every now and then, life will get super busy, and it'll be difficult to get my beta readers on board. Or I might be working with a new group of beta readers, and they just have every intention of reading, and then life happens and they can't show up, and I'm on a deadline. And so at that point, I have hired actually beta readers in the past. There were a couple of folks I have worked with that were really fantastic and worked and did that for really reasonable rates. So in a way, it was kind of like having editor light, like light version. That was helpful. Yeah. Almost like having a developmental editor in a way. So those have been really handy. So anytime I can, I absolutely want to get folks on board beta reading, because not only do they let me know when I'm doing something wrong, but they let me know when I'm doing things right, which is fantastic, because they might say, oh no, like I didn't think he was that kind of person. And I'm like, I'm about to fool you. And this is exactly what I want you to feel right here. So later on, you will be like, So yeah, anytime I can, I absolutely bring them on board. And if I can get my hands on an editor, then I want that.
Right.
So
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And do you have, when you are doing your beta readers, do you have certain questions that you ask them to sort of guide their responses, or do you just let them tell you whatever?
I essentially just tell them, don't worry about things like misspellings or little things like that. You are not here to be my line editor. You don't have to worry about that. Skip right over the top of it. I'm looking for big story things. So were you bored? Did the pacing like drag you down? Did you like this character? Were you surprised? Like, give me just your feedback as you have it. And I
Right.
usually do this in Google Docs. And so I'll have a doc specifically for each reader. So it might say something like the founding war Becca. And then that is the link she has. And then she can leave me comments as she feels things. And then at the very end, I just write, thank you so much for telling me what you think. If you have any final thoughts, like overall thoughts on the story itself, did it work? Did it not work? Did you have your favorite character? Is there any characters that you felt like just didn't work or whatever? I leave a spot for that. But I do try to prep them in the initial email when I send them the link to everything. Don't worry about things like spelling. Focus on big story things like characters, how they made you feel, all that stuff. And that has seemed to help so far. I really haven't had too many people who fell off the wagon there. Although people still do want to correct spelling, they can't help themselves. They'll be like, there
Right.
should be a
Yeah.
comma here. Like, if you want to waste your time doing that, I guess that's up to you. But
And see, I've kind of had the opposite problem. I haven't done a whole lot of intentional, with beta readers in the way you have. So it's totally that I just need to do it. But I do have a critique group that does that for me. So I haven't really, necessarily needed it. But most of the time when I do a final beta reader pass, they almost exclusively correct my grammar. And so I'm going, no, you guys can do other things. You can tell me about how you felt or plot things. And it's like, it's hard for me to get them to actually give that kind of feedback. So it's kind of funny. But yeah, I think it's totally just that I haven't prepped them. So that's interesting. Well, great. I mean, this is so much fun, and you're obviously a very conscientious author, which I think mostly comes with experience. Early authors, they kind of tend to give me really vague answers about things, and they'll be like, I don't know, and things like that. But you are not that way. You know your stuff. So, I mean, how many books do you have written now?
so I have my third novel will be launching on the 26th. And then I wrote, so I used NaNoWriMo to get the first draft up of a new series that I'm working on. So if we're talking about like purely finished works, even if they're not published, then 6. If we're talking about, finished published works, there are 2 out and a third on the way. However, I think it's really important for me to note for folks who are listening, I'm also a freelance writer. I've been a freelance writer for years. And so, of course, that helps. Although those are
Right.
nonfiction things, I, wrote for photography magazines and all that kind of stuff. So that is all very much, nonfiction writing, but
Right.
it still invests you in the world enough that, you pick things up along the way. So,
Yeah, for sure. It still contributes to your 10,000 hours of writing
right.
that you need. Yeah, for sure. For sure. Well, great. I mean, what advice would you have to writers who are just starting out and trying to, make a career out of writing stories?
Ooh, prepare to live in the suck for a while. um don't start writing under the assumption that you're going to make a whole bunch of money right away, or that it's going to become a full-time career right away. As with any artistic endeavor, it is a game of who can last the longest. And
Mm,
if you last long enough, you're almost guaranteed to get something right at some time. But it
right.
does require that grit. And also, if you want to be a full-time author, you need to ask yourself if you also want to be a business person.
Right.
Because, as indie authors, we're running the whole ship. And that requires us to be a marketing person and a bookkeeping person and.
Hmm.
And while we may get a few of those things taken off our plate, if we go with traditional publishing, you still have to be willing to be in the query trenches for a long time. And you still have to be
Right.
willing to, you're going to still have to market yourself, and you're going to need to keep your own books, and all of that still applies. So if you want to be a writer for more than just a hobby, be prepared to be a business person also, and learn as much about that as you can, because I made the same mistakes I think probably many of us make with our first book, where we don't market it enough and we don't know enough really to market it well. And then you learn things along the way. And those books are always going to be valuable, but you have to be willing to fail a lot at first and to be on the bottom of the pile and to sometimes feel bad about yourself and to compare yourself to other authors and go, oh, but they're here and I'm here. Long enough that you kind of slowly climb that ladder and edge your way up. It's worth it, but you have to go into it knowing that that's part of the process so that you don't think there's something wrong with you. And I guess that's the biggest thing maybe I would say is there's nothing wrong with you. This is part of your process. Your journey is not going to look like everybody else's journey, even though you might take bits and pieces of other people's processes and use them for your own. That doesn't mean you're going to end up in the same place they do at the same time. So let your journey be what it is. Don't feel bad. Embrace the fact that it's going to be a struggle, and then just keep going. Because as soon as you get that first email or whatever from a reader who said, this changed my life, or this made me cry, or I had a reader send me a picture of my book on their shelf. And it was like, look, there is Tolkien and Rothfuss and Orson Scott Card and my book. And like that moment, you're like, that's it. That's now you know you're doing the thing you're supposed to do. Like it's the coolest thing ever.
Yeah.
So
yes, thank you for that. That's such wise advice. I think we do hear a lot in the indie author space about how we need to treat this like a business, but at the same time, I don't know that it always clicks for people. Like they just think, oh yeah, I know I do because I need to do ads and sell my book, but really we're building a business from the ground up. And so it's not any different than if you were opening a brick and mortar business. It's going to be a struggle. You're going to have to figure it out. You're an entrepreneur now. And I really, really loved the way that you framed that. So thank you for that. And thank you so much for being here. Where can people find all of your books?
Yes, so they can find first, my website is just NicoleYork.com. So all of my books are listed on there with all their synopses and things, and they're all available on Amazon. It's Amazon exclusive right now. I have the intention. It used to be wide. I didn't have the time to keep track of everything. So it will be wide again, but for now it's all Amazon exclusive. And the last name is McKeon. I know McEwen is one of those names that it sounds one way and people always spell it some different way, but just in case.
Great. I will link those up in the show notes so that people can find you. And just good luck with everything. And it sounds like you have a really promising career ahead of you.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Absolutely.